Hey everybody, welcome to another Games that Infuriate Me to No End. This is anything that requires you or otherwise forces you to grind in order to progress. Now there's going to be a few variations on what grinding actually is depending on which game you're playing, so I have two main examples on display for you here, which are Warframe and Destiny 2, both of which I've been messing around with recently, and in the case of Destiny 2, I was working on either getting an MTO or a full review of the Forsaken expansion done, but given how ridiculously grindy it is, I just have absolutely no desire to at this point. Meanwhile, in the case of Warframe, I'm just working on getting an updated MTO done, and I should actually be able to get that done because frankly the type of grinding in it is less egregious than that of Destiny 2. So what do I actually mean by grinding in the first place? Well, the concept of grinding is basically just repeating some arbitrary task that depends entirely on which game you're playing over and over and over and over again until you achieve whatever desired result it is. Now, in most instances, you'll come across grinding in a particular game that will either be a higher player character level in order to just be more powerful, or it'll be a specific piece of gear or multiple pieces of gear that you're grinding for in order to become more powerful. And in most games, that's completely optional. You don't necessarily need the absolute best gear in the game or to be absolute max level in order to finish a particular game. And that's the way it should be handled. It should always be something that is completely optional and never forced on the player, because grinding is in itself an extremely tedious and ultimately boring process. And the words tedium and boredom should never, under any circumstances, be associated with the term video game. After all, video games are entertainment. They're supposed to be enjoyable on some level, whether that be intellectually, emotionally, or just in the realm of fun factor. And as long as a grind is completely optional in a given game, you can focus on the elements that do make that game enjoyable. This all changes once the grind becomes mandatory, because then you actually have to focus on the grind itself rather than the things about the game that you were enjoying in the first place. This brings me to my two examples, Destiny 2 and Warframe, both of which are games that are not necessarily about the things that you may actually enjoy about them, but are in fact entirely about the grind. The main difference is how they actually go about forcing the grind on the player. In the case of Destiny 2, up until you hit level 20, the grind is actually pretty reasonable and is mostly just tied with playing the game normally. As long as you're just going and playing through the adventures and the story missions and such, you're never really going to notice the grind all that much, until you finish the main story of the game, and you move on to the DLC content, or you get into the endgame content and you realize exactly what the game is. You see, by the time you end the main story of Destiny 2, you're likely to be somewhere in the 18 to 20 level range, and by that point, you're noticing that the level ups are getting much slower, but you're still able to complete them. But the level ups at that point really aren't all that important. What's instead important is what's known as your power level, which is based entirely on what gear you have. You see, apart from the Forsaken expansion requiring your character level to be 30 in order to embark on that quest line to begin with, the actual determining factor of whether or not you're actually going to be able to go on missions is your power level. So you end up having to grind in order to get better gear so you can go on the additional missions. Because there's no level scaling in the missions themselves. When you go on a particular mission, it's going to be at whatever power level they arbitrarily decided was going to be the power level for that mission, and if you're not at least that power level or higher, then you're going to run into noticeable problems. Enemies are going to be taking less damage than you would really hope they would take, and they're going to be doing a lot more damage to you than you would really hope they would do. And if the disparity between the power level of your player character and the power level of the mission you're trying to embark on is great enough, then you're going to find you're basically not doing any damage to the enemies at all, and they're pretty much one-shotting you. And thus, you have to go out of your way to repeat the same repetitive tasks over and over and over again to get incrementally better equipment until eventually your power level is high enough to be able to take on the mission. And of course, because Destiny 2 is really all about the grind, the power level of the missions continues to increase as you continue to go through them. So, for example, with the Forsaken expansion, not only do you have to be a minimum of character level 30 to start them in the first place, but you start out being at a recommended power level of 330, with the next mission recommending 340, then the next one recommending 360, then 390, 400, 410, 420, 430, 440, 450, and finally by the time you hit the final mission in the Forsaken storyline, they recommend 460 power level. Now at first that might sound pretty reasonable until you realize that going from power level 330 to power level 340 is a matter of several hours of gameplay. And all of that for a mission that you will complete in maybe 10 to 15 minutes at most. And that's the case with every single mission throughout the entire campaign. And not only is that the case with every single mission in the Forsaken expansion, that was the case in the Curse of Osiris and Warmind DLCs as well. And regardless of which content you decided to play, ultimately you still had to grind in order to get to whatever requisite power level was needed to be able to go through a particular mission without just getting your ass handed to you. And once you hit that point, it's no longer about what cool new equipment you can find, it's about what equipment you can find that has the arbitrary numbers needed to boost your power level up more. And sure, I get that endgame in a looter shooter or just a looter game in general is supposed to be about optimizing your builds or whatever, but it just completely saps every last bit of fun that was in the base mechanics to begin with out of the game and replaces it with a need to go and play the completely menial, pointless content just so you can get a higher arbitrary power number to be able to progress through the actual storyline. It's the kind of thing you would describe as filler content or padding. It just artificially lengthens the game and is frankly an incredibly cheap and lazy way of going about doing so. And since your ultimate payoff is just going to be some fairly mediocre story missions that barely last any length of time and then require you to grind even more just so you can go to the next one, it just means you don't really want to complete the grind to start that stuff in the first place. And since the power level progression in Destiny 2 is so slow to begin with, and it only gets slower the further in you get, I just decided to not even bother finishing the Forsaken expansion at all, which is why I'm honestly not even doing an MTO on it. I used the booster that came with the Forsaken expansion to get my Titan leveled up to 330 power level and of course character level 30 so I could actually start the expansion in the first place, and then once I got through that, it was still power level 330, although my character level had gone up to level 31 at least, and then I spent the next hour or so grinding out new equipment that finally managed to get me up to power level 332 by the end of that hour or so. It was at that point I decided I had better things to do and just went off to do literally anything else, one of which was actually messing around with Warframe, which of course leads me into the other main type of grinding that you might encounter with a particular game like this. In the case of Warframe, there's actually a lot less to say about it, because the type of grinding you have in that is just for getting resources that you can use to craft the various things that you're going to be using throughout the rest of the game. I mean, sure, the game does technically have leveled enemies, and the higher level the enemy is, the more damage they're going to do to you, and the less damage they're going to take from you, but the progression isn't necessarily tied to a specific arbitrary power level number, as much as it's just tied to completing missions in a certain sequence instead. I mean, the closest thing you have to that is the various junctions that will require you to complete some specific tasks in order to be able to go into that junction, and then you'll have to fight a boss enemy once you go into the junction, and once you defeated that boss, then you unlock the ability to go to the next planet, and then you just complete a specific chain of events in order to be able to go to the next junction, and so on and so forth. But again, you're not just simply grinding out better gear so you can get to the requisite power level to keep going. Instead, you're just playing the game normally, and by the time you get to the next junction, you've probably gained enough levels and mods and such to handle the content that's going to be beyond that junction without too much trouble. So instead of grinding to progress, like in say Destiny 2, which is the extremely poor way of doing it, you're grinding to collect resources that you can use to build new and different equipment than what you were already using, because what you're already using is perfectly viable right from the very beginning of the game and right until the very end of it, in fact. But of course, using the exact same gear throughout the entire progression of Warframe would just get extremely boring, so they give you access to a bunch of different equipment, and the way you go about actually earning that equipment is by collecting a bunch of resources and then building it in your foundry, which generally takes a matter of about 8 to 12 hours because this is a free-to-play game, and the way they try to monetize everything is to give you incentive to buy things so it is faster than just playing it in the free-to-play form. And that is ultimately why the grind in Warframe is less egregious than that of Destiny 2, because even though the grind in Warframe is still incredibly boring, especially if you're playing it solo, that grind does not prevent you from progressing. So to give you an example based on what I've been playing recently, I've been working on getting a new Warframe, so I've been having to grind out materials for that, but if I wanted to go to the next planet in the progression, I could still do that. There's nothing preventing me from going to the next planet other than just completing whatever missions are required in order to get access to the junction. And while the junction requirements may include things like having to kill 300 or more of a certain enemy type, chances are when I'm just going through the missions on that planet in the normal progression, I'll probably take out that many enemies to begin with. It's not necessarily things that you have to go out of your way to grind in order to complete. But let's say during the normal course of play you get a bunch of blueprints for some weapons and even a warframe, so you decide, well, let's actually go ahead and build those so we can try something a bit different. Well, that's when the grind really comes in, because it's going to require a ton of resources, and those tend to take an absolutely ludicrous amount of time to grind out. To give you an example, one of the things that I've been trying to work on lately is a part for a new Warframe, and it requires 15,000 polymer bundles, which if I'm playing solo, I can gather at a rate of about 800 or so polymer bundles per 20 minutes of gameplay. But to do that, I have to stop whatever other things I was doing. If I was working on quests or whatever, I have to basically drop doing that and go to a very specific mission and play that mission over and over and over again to get those polymer bundles. Now again, you don't have to do that to progress, but let's face it, playing with the same exact equipment for the entirety of your time through Warframe would just be incredibly dull. But then of course, by having the resource grind in there, you also end up making the game dull anyway, so it ends up just being kind of a self-defeating loop there. Of course, with Warframe, you can make the argument that since it's a free-to-play game, the alternative to grinding out new equipment and new Warframes and things like that would just be being forced to buy it, but that's still not going to excuse just how tedious the grind actually is. Oh, and don't give me that crap about just play it in co-op, DW, it's fine, because it's not fine. The grind is still there, and if my friends aren't online at the same time I am, which is very frequent, then I can't play it in co-op. And of course, if I go into the public matchmaking, then I'm going to end up with a bunch of randos who aren't playing it for the same reasons I am, and they're just going to end up doing whatever they want, and probably getting mad at me for trying to grind out resources. So I'm just going to end up frustrated either way in that regard. There's not really anything I can do about it. So I've covered forcing you to grind so you can actually progress through storyline and such like that, and I've covered grinding for resources so you can get access to new things, but what about in games where the grind is considered optional? Well, for some of them it's fine, the grind is completely optional, but then there are games like the earlier Final Fantasy games which force so many random encounters on you that you may as well be grinding anyway. Now I get it, random encounters go back to tabletop RPGs where you'd just be wandering around the wilderness and then the DM would roll something on a table and oh look, now there's just a bunch of kobolds attacking you. Well, here's the thing, that's okay in a tabletop RPG because tabletop RPGs have strategy. You have your entire table working together to defeat the enemies, and of course you have a wide variety of things you can do. It's basically completely freeform. In the case of a JRPG like Final Fantasy, there is no freeform nature to it. You're literally all standing in a line and taking turns whacking each other in the face. It's one of the most ludicrously boring combat systems you could ever possibly have in an RPG-like game. And in the case of these older JRPGs where they constantly force you into random encounters with some blob monster that was just like, hey, screw that guy in particular, it's just not even remotely fun, and it just drags the entire experience down, which when you get down to it is exactly the same thing as grinding. It forces you into a repetitive and tedious task over and over and over again, with the end result being, what, in the case of a JRPG, just lengthening the game artificially. So sure, technically going out of your way to do that repetitive, tedious task for some particular result, whether that be some ultimate weapon or just getting to max level or whatever, is optional, but let's face it, you're gonna be grinding anyway. Developers everywhere, please do us all a favor and stop with this crap. It's not fun, it never was fun, and if you seem to think it's fun, you are completely deluding yourself. what you are actually doing is just wasting our time with repetitive, tedious, boring crap. We don't play video games to be bored. We play them to be entertained. And while maybe that works for the first hour or so of the initial grind, once the grind actually sets in, we're not being entertained anymore. We're just doing work. And frankly, if we wanted to do work, we would just go to our jobs and get some overtime in, because you know what? At least we're being paid for that, and then we can spend that money on things we either need or things that we want. And while we certainly want video games, what we don't want is to play a video game and feel like we would have our time better spent doing literally anything else. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all in later videos.